System riding to the core. Yeah. Reppin' in the city left.
I mean, TMK and emoji a little tanky somewhere for Inner City Left. Today is Monday, August 19th, and we are very excited, very honored, and very privileged to have Charisse Burden-Stelly with us. I want to talk a little bit about her before we get started. Associate Professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University, the author of Black Scare, Red Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism in the United States, and co-author with Dr. Gerald Horne of W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History. I'm going to put all that in the description, as well as all the great rest of that bio in the description. I just wanted to ask you, Dr. CBS, how you doing? And thank you so much for being on the show.
I'm doing okay. Thank you for asking. I just moved back to Detroit. I was in Boston for a year. And so there are a ton of boxes that I am staring at in front of me. Very hectic, but all is well. How are you all?
Man, lovely.
Doing so well. Glad that you found time for us. Even that moving process is so difficult, especially if you're going from Boston to Detroit. I mean, it's like way different than being in city. So again, I thank you so much for your time.
Of course.
I wanted to jump right in here because, again, I just want to say Dr. CBS has a great Twitter feed. I use it often, just checking it every day and seeing what's going on. We often use it. A lot of your tweets for Inner City Left's Instagram page. So I did do a little diving in there, but I really wanted to get to this because this is something that me and Emoja have been talking about. And Emoja, feel free to jump in after Dr. CBS. But there seems to be this thing in the Harris Waltz campaign right now. I'm actually checking out their website. And there is no policies anywhere here. This is, I think, day 28 of no policies for a presidential candidate here, like one of the biggest parties. And if I look at Dr. Jill Stein, or I look at a libertarian platform, or I look at, perhaps the PSL platform with Claudia de la Cruz, there's tons of policies on there. But when you go to the Harris Waltz page, it really is just like meet Kamala Harris, meet Tim Waltz, these little puff pieces, and take action, which is like, volunteer for us. I wanted to ask you, Doctor, is this something you've ever seen in politics? And what does this mean for people who are potential voters for this person?
Well, I do think that in the last couple of days, she's dropped a few economic piecemeal policies that she would like to implement, like up to $25,000 for first-time homeowners, up to a $6,000 tax credit for your first child, and some bits and bobs here and there, but it in no way comes together or coalesces as a policy agenda. And I think it is relatively abnormal, but I also think it's to her benefit because if we recall in 2020, she was at the very bottom of the heap, right? She dropped, she was one of the first people to drop out. She has no base, right? No base to speak of. I guess now, anyway, at that moment, she had no base. She was getting beat by like Buttigieg and everybody. And so at no point are we aware of what her policies are, what she's advocating. And I think that that's to her benefit because as I read somewhere that one of the moderate Democrats said that gives her the biggest possible tent, right? And so I think that she's able to ride, vibes, memes, identity reductionism at this point. Number one, because she entered the race so late, and because I think that she's a very shallow candidate, and so it works to her benefit. And to be fair, a lot of the campaign promises are bullshit anyway, right? So there's a number of things that Biden had promised, up to and including canceling student loan debt. If we remember the Build Back Better, what I would call the Build Back Basic, none of which came to fruition, right? And so campaign promises are bullshit anyway. And so I understand the sort of lack of, or people's critique of her lack of a platform, but at the same time, those things are just kind of chimeras, if you will, anyway. So
Yeah, I feel like in many ways you can argue that's part of the point is to not have them, right? So that the voter cannot go back and be like, "You promised us this." She can say with full honesty, "I never promised you anything. I did not promise any of these things." Um, I think I would like so if I can, I still have a sneaking suspicion that we have not fully seen the Democrats settle in, and what I mean by this is I feel like if the Democrats were totally settled on Kamala, right, Biden would not just say, I'm not running, but I'm actually going to step down so that she can have 3 or 4 months of experience. She has the stick. It gets rid of the whole, this is an inexperienced candidate. We have not seen that. We've seen a letter from Joe Biden saying that he won't run. And in that letter, he ostensibly endorses Kamala, but we haven't seen him on the campaign trail with her. We haven't seen him, right? And so my question to you is, what do you think the chances are in the Democratic Party, the party convention that they're having, that there may still be another candidate that has not yet made his face known?
It's possible, but I think that they did one campaign event together, maybe in Delaware. Um, I think it's to her benefit that he doesn't step down because she doesn't want to inherit this turd. And so I think that actually that bodes well for her that he's not stepping down because he's notoriously unpopular. He's a lame duck at this point. There, the ongoing, war intensified genocide in Gaza is squarely on his shoulders. Not, genocide in Biden or genocide Joe, as folks call him. And so I actually think it'll be to her detriment if he stepped down and was just like, here, take,
Right.
take this over. And so I think that the party machine's actually doing her a favor in that regard. In terms of somebody coming out the woodwork, it could happen, but it seems to me that the donors have coalesced around Kamala. It seems that the propaganda machine has already been ramping up. And so, unless it's somebody like Manchin, who sort of comes out the woodwork, who I had read that at one point he was going to re-enlist as a Democrat from having switched over to an independent to take a run for the president, but the presidency. But I who knows what can happen? It's all, it's bread and circuses. But I would be shocked if she was not the presidential nominee because she's gotten all the big people. So she's gotten Nancy Pelosi's, the human cold sword that is Hillary Clinton. Obama finally came out and supported Biden, and so it seems like she's got that sewed up.
It seems as if, too, that the Harris campaign has done everything they can to sort of appeal to the never Trumpers, like those Republican, the Nikki Haley candidacy, the Nikki Haley vote, as some of the Democrats have said. And it seems, because now, I mean, obviously the honeymoon period had, set in, and there was this, I think you might have been alluding to it a little bit earlier, Dr. CBS, but the white woman Zoom call where it was like white women only, and like
It was
sort
every
of,
demographic. It was Black women, Latinx women, white men, white women. So it's like every demographic had their weird call. I got that text. I reported it as spam. I thought it was spam, but it was real.
yeah, I mean, it goes back to your point, and we talk about this as well, sort of the idea of vibes, and this vibes candidacy. And I think that honeymoon period obviously is abruptly, at a halt here because you still see the protests that were plaguing every single Democratic rally or whatever it may be is now continued. And I wanted to talk about this because this is something that was on the internet, and I think it was many of us, considered it a psyop or whatever. It seemed to try to, pit, the Black community or the African community or even the global South community sort of against Gaza and that. And I just wanted to ask both of y'all sort of, number one, did you find that to be the case? And number two, what is the history of, Black activism or global South activism in solidarity with Gaza or the
I,
Palestinians?
so it did seem like a psyop. However, I do want to caution us on um reducing every backward and reactionary discourse to a psyop, because I think that that really obfuscates the Americanism of just regular, ordinary civil society, right? And so it's possible that a psyop can then sort of drum up those sentiments, but it's also possible that this backward thinking can be sort of endogenous in the community. And I will, in the identity reductionist liberals, this is very much on par with them. And we saw some of this actually during the encampment moment, right? So there was some critiques of, so there weren't very many HBCUs, for example, that had encampments. But then on top of that, there was some critiques at certain institutions of Black students not being as supportive. And in this regard, class matters. If you have any internationalist perspective matters. We can't just assume that people do, right? Because I mean, intuitively, it's like genocide is bad. Everybody's against genocide. But then there's, arguments about sort of, you know what it reminds me of, and this is a little bit tangential. It reminds me of Africa. I'm an African American studies PhD and professor, and there was a moment in African American studies where there was a backlash against the preponderance of African and Caribbean professors and students in the discipline, because it was African Americans who had organized and struggled primarily for this discipline, and they continue to be very underrepresented. And then there's a class component to it, because by and large, African and Caribbean students tend to be in a different class position as African Americans, right? And so this argument kind of reminds me of that. It's like African Americans are always at the forefront of these struggles. With, this representation of this Black woman matters to us, and we're supposed to not vote for her because of what's happening in a place we've never heard of. Now, that is not my politic. I'm Pan-Africanist, I'm an internationalist, but I think that all I'm saying is that there is some sort of endogenous political analysis that can't just be reduced to a psyop. And then the internet makes everything ridiculous, right? So then there's this mudslinging, like calling people watermelon people, which is crazy for Black people to call any group watermelon people. But anyway, so those are just some errant thoughts about that. But of course, there's a long, long history of Black and Palestinian solidarity. Kwame Ture and the All African People's Revolutionary Party. There's Malcolm X and the Organization of Afro-American Unity. There also is, I will say, a long history of Black support for Zionism, especially around the 1930s and 1940s, because of people like W.E.B. Du Bois's experience in Europe when fascism was taking off, because of the resonances between Black nationalism and Zionism. And so it's complicated, but I think that by and large, for persons who see themselves as like the third world and the first world, or as colonized subjects, there is a sort of inherent recognition of solidarity with Palestinians, not to mention that African Americans charged the United States or the United Nations with genocide, before the United Nations in 1951. So genocide is something I think that organizing against genocide is something that's part of our history and our struggles. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm with you most of the way on that. The only thing that led me to believe, particularly in the possibility of the psyop for this, is the sloganism, right? When you have these tested slogans that are ready to go so quick, and Watermelon People is a wonderful example of that. Like, I am from the South. This is not something Black people would say about any other person because of the implications as it relates to us. And the fact that it was used, it works as a double pejorative. You know what I'm saying? So those are the kind of things. And also to your point of Kamala not having a natural base, even in the way that like an Obama did, right? People are jumping on this bandwagon, but a lot of this is manufactured consent, right? It's like, oh, this is the one, right? This is 2 years ago, even, we did not have this huge interest in Kamala Harris, even as the vice president. Her role in this White House has been almost non-existent when you compare and contrast it to like a Dick Cheney, who keeps his opinions really throughout the entire spectrum of all of this. She keeps this plausible deniability. And so, it could go either way for me. I felt like it felt weird to me going back to like the whole class argument, because I am a protester. I remember what it was like being in them protest, when Ferguson popped off, and getting, the data online on Twitter from Palestinian activists. Like, this is the way, you get tear gas out of your eyes. Like this, the links between Black resistance struggle and Palestinian they're inextricable. I mean, at least, again, from class perspectives, when you're coming from the lowest perspectives of the Black community, we have almost 100% respect, because we see ourselves echoed in the Palestinian struggle. You can be killed at any time, no matter what rank you've appealed. You can be a doctor, you can be a press agent. It doesn't matter. If they choose to eliminate you, you can be eliminated. And we went through this with the Black experience. My question to you, Dr. CBS, would be like, when I look at academics like Dr. Tommy Curry, who I love, who had to flee the country, and not flee the country, but chose to leave the country to be able to continue to practice safely with his family. James Baldwin also, expatting and going to France. Like, even Saul Williams, right? I don't know if he's back in America, but I know he was in France for a good long time. What do you think is the responsibility of the contemporary Black leftists as it relates to the empire, right? Like, and you can answer that any way you want, like as far as voting, like as far as like, do we have an obligation to stay and make it better? So just take that however, and just run with that.
I mean, I think that we have the responsibility to wage struggle where we are, right? And so I think that if you are an expatriate, then what that means is so similar to what James Baldwin did, sort of being in solidarity and grounding with Algerians, and really lifting up, the fact that they're like the niggas of France at that particular historical moment, and continue to be so, quite frankly, right? Arab and Muslim populations in Europe are treated very much how African Americans, and to be fair, the African immigrants are not, it's not like they're treated much better, but they're treated, how African Americans are here, up to and including these race riots we just saw recently in the UK. And so I think that we have the responsibility to wage struggle where we are. And, I'm not a voter. I'm not, and I think that the reduction of politics to electoralism actually is quite backward. But I do think that if it is that we believe our own analysis and that fascism is nascent, embryonic, or in fact already here, as George Jackson would argue, then we need all hands on deck, right? And so if you're a Black liberal and voting is your thing, then organize for voting, right? Like, use this election as an opportunity for political education. If you are a communist, you need to be working to, organizing the working class. I would say with Black workers as a center, that's my particular orientation. If you are, a trot, sell newspapers, just kidding. I don't know. I think that we need all hands on deck. And I think that popular fronts or united fronts are always treacherous for the left, because the left tends to get the short shrift of that, like communists in particular. But I do think that we're in a moment where there's enough bad that everybody should be doing what it is that you think. Like, if you're anarchist, be doing the mutual aid, right, and the arresting and those sorts of things. I think that there's enough for everyone, and I do think that as Black leftists and Black folks, we have a responsibility to attack the belly of the beast from within. At the same time, that I completely understand, like, if all your life you had to fight and you want to go to Canada, right? You want to go to Nicaragua or whatever. I understand that too. And there's a lot of work to be done in all these other places, because as we know, US imperialism is global, right? There's no place where its tentacles have not stretched. And so I don't judge folks who want to leave. I don't judge folks who are going to go down with the ship. I'm of that sort of orientation. I judge those who think that there is a viable solution long term, other than negotiating the terms of our immiseration under this current system.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about, like, you resist in the ways that you can. I would say about like nascent fascism. I returned to Dr. Lawrence Britt in 2003
Hmm.
with his 14 characteristics of what fascism is. I would say we're way
Right.
past, nascent fascism. And this is something that hasn't changed. It did not change through the Obama years. It did not change through the Trump years. just continue to advance in the ways that it wanted to do. Um, and you could argue maybe even earlier to that, going back to the carnivore program in the 2000s, I'm sorry, the 90s, which is predating even a 9/11, right? So you don't have this national security imperative, and yet you still have this massive surveillance of American online activity, right? So
Mhm.
those are things that I would say that. What do you have? I mean,
Well, Dr. CBS, you had mentioned we've been you mentioned imperialism, and we've been talking myself and Emoja and really the Anderson Left team about sort of these attempted coups that are just it seems like every few weeks we're getting a attempted coup here, attempted color revolution, or one that succeeds. Many people think the Bangladesh
Hmm.
interim president is a completely Western backed puppet. Again, there's a lot of there's a lot of I think evidence to support that, but I don't want to get too far into it. Obviously, Venezuela, the United States is constantly trying to appoint someone else as the president. We saw this also happen in Bolivia. I wanted to ask, do you agree that those are coups, and sort of the history, or the context surrounding the continuation? Oh, and one more thing. I actually just saw this and I specifically wanted to ask you. I'm sorry, there's just so many things. I'm just, again, excited to have y'all. It looks like the president of Haiti was assassinated, I believe, a year and a half ago, and it looks like two of the people that are in connection with that assassination are former DEA informants.
DEA. Imagine
So
that.
again, do you see it that way? And sort of, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the other interesting part about Haiti is that Petro was trying to do kind of like a diplomatic mission in Haiti. He had gone to the DR and was trying to get to Haiti, partly to negotiate the extradition of some of the other assassins who are Colombian. So that's also an interesting caveat. And I wonder if that is connected in any way to his coming out basically on the side of the United States with respect to Venezuela, calling for new elections, as did Lula. Lula been a hoe though, because Lula has been in support of the reoccupation of Haiti for nearly a decade at this point. And so, you know, the Jamima Pierre has spoke often about how the radicalism and internationalism of everybody seems to stop at the shores of Haiti. So I'm not surprised that it's the former informants who are part of that assassination plot, because I mean, that conveys that they're doing the bidding of the United States. The United States is quick to discard any puppet that it no longer sees fit. And, as we know that there's a very, very long arc in history of this. I think these various, machinations that you pointed out are coups, but we also have to understand the ways that sanctions are also attempts at regime change. So from Zimbabwe to Venezuela, and it's been we see the sort of growing effectiveness of the Venezuela sanctions over time, right? Cuba, these are weapons of war, and so I think that there's been a long combination, of U.S. military bases, 845 encircling the globe, of sanctions, of these soft coups, and of just color revolutions, not least of what like the color revolution in Ukraine that happened under Barack Obama, that are was part of the build up to the current Russia-Ukraine war. And so, the US, this is classic imperial overreach. I keep saying this because the US is ready to launch yet another war in the Middle East. Has seemingly completely abandoned Ukraine. I guess it's still sending money here and there. And has you know, different operations happening on the African continent. It seems to be ready to gear up for some destabilization, continued destabilization of Niger and Burkina Faso. I think that they're going to be building a base in Cote d'Ivoire, because Niger kicked the U.S. out, the U.S. military out. And so all of this, it can't be. So for people who say that foreign policy doesn't matter, the reason why our roads are crumbling, the reason why we do not have health care, the reason why we have terrible education, um, world historic homelessness, is because of the spending priorities. And this is not a defense budget, right? This is a warmongering budget. This is a US global domination budget, and that is why we're suffering in the way that we are. And so um we really have to understand and make those connections. And so because, so back to the first, or one of the first questions you asked, persons are saying like, I'm supposed to lose my rights here domestically for Palestinians. And it's like, honey, these rights are already entwined. And if they can be taken away by a president, they weren't yours to begin with. So, yeah.
No, 100%. Like when you talk about foreign policy and the impact it has on domestic policy, I remember in 2016, one of the few times that Bernie Sanders took questions from Black activists and they asked him about reparations, and his answer was reparations are divisive. But Ukraine funding this army of literal Banderite Nazis, right? That's where your reparations went. That was $500 billion that was put towards just a soft proxy war with Russia, which continues to destabilize to the point whereas you have differing messages from inside of even the White House, where Biden is like, I'm completely aware of what's happening with the Sochi invasion. Meanwhile, you have the Department of Defense saying, this took us by surprise, but we support it, right? You don't even have a cohesive messaging coming out of the executive branch. But all of those things are connected. I remember when you mentioned Lula, he's someone I just cannot get a feel for one way or the other. This is a person that nominated Argentina for BRICS, but has not done a whole lot to help Venezuela achieve BRICS, right? Even when you look at his domestic record, which is, as South America goes, relatively progressive, it's hard to, he's definitely not a Bolivarian, like not in any stretch of the imagination. But he's decidedly to the left of the other alternatives, such as Bolsonaro, and I would say significantly to the left of Biden, Obama, or even Kamala. So Lula's an enigma that I just cannot figure one way or the other. I would like to ask you, Dr. CBS, do you see BRICS having a role in the development and anti-oppression struggles in the 21st century? What, if any, do you see the roles of BRICS as it relates to anti-oppression struggle in the next century?
I think that that's a really difficult question, because when you have Argentina, right, the nomination of Argentina under somebody like Javier Milei, what does that actually mean? And even the South African government, I mean, it's not that the ANC was no panacea, but this coalition government that they're having to form is definitely more right wing than the ANC government. And so it really depends on these, the regimes that are at the helm of BRICS. I do think it is good as it moves toward de-dollarization, but if it is that some of these heads of state are in the pocket of the United States, or are puppets of the United States, then the counter hegemonic force that it's supposed to serve is continually in question. And again, I'll echo, something that Jamima Pierre says, is like, we constantly talk about, multipolarity and pluriversality. But if those coalitions are still supportive of, for example, the undermining of sovereignty of Haiti and and are willing to destabilize Venezuela, what does that actually mean? That there's just more countries who are asserting dominance in particular ways, right? And so I'm not sure. I do think that de-dollarization and having more South-South forms of trade and development agendas is a good thing. But in the context of a capitalist world system, all of these things are going to be malformed. They're all going to, I think, fall short. And especially if militarism continues to be the method of foreign policy, then everything is going to be geared toward more weapons, defense, et cetera, anyway, right? And which is one might argue part of the issues with the Soviet Union, for example, right, is that when you have socialist countries that are constantly having to spend outsized portions of their budget on defense, then that undermines any sort of anti-imperialist project, I think, writ large. So we'll see.
Great points. Great points. I wanted to get to this too, because you've both been mentioning it. There is this idea, or this thought process, that sort of those sanctions, and the United States is sanctioning 60% of the world's population, that the funding of Ukraine, the unwavering support of the Israeli Zionist state is sort of lessening their grip of, this, what do you call it? Like, I don't want to say, the single power, the number one, and we were, reading that in the 1950s, America had 50% of the world's GDP. That is obviously far reduced. And because of that, and I don't know if you agree with this, but because of that, it does look like the United States is dwindling as a world power. And not only that, we're seeing it happen domestically here. Like you said, foreign policy affecting our everyday domestic lives here. Homelessness. We're over a 1 million homeless peoples here in the United States. We had
people with active COVID infections.
The COVID infection is absolutely there, surging again. We already saw the Harris Waltz campaign come out and say that they are not for Medicare for all, which I mean, not to say that I thought that they were, but it seemed not to mention here in Washington,
Tougher on
D.C.
the border than Trump.
That is something that she was saying. But we also hear things like, you know, there is not, there's no funding for these things. And obviously we're sending, tons of money overseas constantly, whether it to be, like I said, Ukraine or Israel, whatever it may be. Not to mention here in Washington, D.C., 70% of our budget is used for the police force. And every major city, I mean, the defund the police movement seems to have just gone out with a whimper. But do you see that, these sanctions and the overarching American militarism across the world is affecting sort of everyday people here, and how so?
I mean, absolutely. I think that the fact that there are, I think, over 40 cop cities in construction, and that there is a cop city in every country except for it's either Montana or North Dakota. I think it's Montana. And almost every single state, that really mirrors the fact that there are US military bases that encircle the globe. And the militarization of the police is a function of controlling the masses as more and more people are pushed toward right their life as a Gombin, to use a Gombin's term. And the fact that protesters are being charged with domestic terrorism, that is very significant, right? Terrorism for protesting. And these are largely peaceful, nonviolent, non-destructive protests. These people are being charged with domestic terrorism. That means something, right? If it is that um, protesting for basic rights and like people-centered human rights is an act of terrorism against the state, what exactly is that saying about the state and to what the state is committed? And so, um, these are the conditions for either fascism or like a left revolution, right? A communist or socialist revolution. And unfortunately, in this state, the latter is not likely because historically the US has been much more amenable to fascism than to communism or socialism. And because I think that we still, if we're thinking alongside Gerald Horne, we still have yet to really contend with the white supremacy of the working class. It's not just the ruling class, right? The white supremacy of ordinary people, 80 plus million who voted for Trump in 2020. That's not happenstance, right? And so I think that um we're you know I think we're reaching an inflection point. And so I keep saying let us assume that Harris Walls are able to pull this circus off. There's just this assumption that those who did not vote for them are just going to accept that. If January 6th was a dress rehearsal, what do you think is going to come in 2025? And we're not organized. The left is not organized at all for that. We keep fear mongering about Project 2025, but what is the organizing that's happening for its eventuality? And so these are the things that I'm thinking about. But, and in that context, the organizing, again, is going to be harder because of these RICO charges that are being levied at organizers, and the anti-protesting laws that have been passed in something like 22 states. So um again, none of this is apart from the militarization of US foreign policy, US domestic policy, and the complete sort of hollowing out of any pretense of welfare state that once was.
Yeah, I would say two things come to my mind. Um, One, just how good the Americans are at changing culture fast. I think about the mollification of the black bourgeois class, right? In the South, we grew up with stories of W.E.B. Du Bois going to his university with a shotgun, like being prepared for all. Now, that may or may not be true, but these are things we were told growing up, even Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, these are guys that definitely practiced the Panthers, right? However, now through the marketing of really over the past 40 years of this concept of black on black crime and the equating of black gun ownership with thuggery, right? You're in no position to have a leftist class that can have any type of a sustained um, insurrection in the most militarized country in the world. But it leads to the second thought, right? And that's the full errand that full spectrum dominance was. As you say, in the 50s, full spectrum dominance might have been a thing that was achievable, where your military doctrine is to have the best everything, the best army, the best technology, the best navy, the best marines, right? These things are no longer true. And it's in no small part the geopolitical expectations of the empire that brought these things apart at the seams. You can look at one third of the United States Navy is in the Middle East right now. That's not sustainable. If nothing happened, if war didn't even pop off, which by the way is inevitable, um, the economic footprint of having 2 to 3 aircraft carrier groups, I mean, these are real things. People have to rotate out. These things require fuel, they require food. This is before any military act happened. Just them existing is a very expensive thing, to say nothing of what happens when they start to come under fire. Because again, in the 90s, in the 2000s, with the deindustrialization of the United States, you're not talking about a manufacturing class anymore. Manufacturing has been outsourced. And so the moment that should have been a national security issue for these incredibly nationalistic, militaristic people in the beginning. You're not in a place where you can replace these things should they go. And the United States is not used to dealing with peer or near peer militaries, where there
I
can
mean,
be consequences.
just to add to that is the erosion of human capital. There are like isn't like 60% or something of this population obese, and I don't mean to be fat phobic, or I know that that term is controversial, but there's a physical test and also a aptitude test that you have to take with respect, like some written test.
Mhm.
And to your point, what goes along with a strong industrial manufacturing base is a relatively educated electorate, because you have to have workers who know how to do stuff. The complete sort of defunding of public education is concomitant with this outsourcing of everything. You don't need a relatively educated population. You just incarcerate them, right? Or you kill them slowly with like high fructose corn syrup and polluted areas to live. And
Or
so
COVID,
there's
which is
also
a permanent debuff.
there's no so there's also not the human capital, right? To even if we look at the Israeli army, they're not winning like hand to hand combat. It's US high powered weaponry that is allowing them to decimate the Palestinians. And now they're having to draft the ultra Orthodox. And so their whole civil society is revolting as well. And so I think so there's a lot going on. And so yeah, the militarism is not sustainable. Yeah.
And that goes to the exact point of full spectrum dominance, right? The Israelis were never in a place to practice full spectrum dominance because they don't have the kind of economy that could sustain such a thing. And so they've overemphasized air power, which goes back to the entire population being casualty averse. This is why when you see the IDF on the ground, they're not able to have these kind of dominant performances like in the Six-Day War, which have in many ways become mythologized. They've Sparta'd themselves as far as what their actual military capabilities are. Because again, they also have not fought near peer adversaries, which is coming. Um, they don't have, I look at their tactics on the ground and I think these forces would not survive a week in the Ukrainian war. It's just the way that they move tanks. They don't have anything to take into account loitering munitions. Their military is still stuck in the 20th century, except for their Air Force, which is state of the art. Second, maybe only to the Americans. But you cannot occupy land with the Air Force. That takes an army, and that's what they're discovering in Gaza.
There was one comment I wanted to make, and I have one final question for me. And again, thank y'all so much. This has been a great conversation. I to Dr. CBS's point, the last two elections here in the United States have been marred by controversy. There was the whole Mueller report, and Russia hacked the elections. They hacked them, and then people believed that for quite some time. And then there was the conversation, obviously that ended in January 6th with dead people voting and all these things. And again, I'm not saying that elections can't be rigged. I'm not there. I don't know. But I am saying that it has been this enormous blowback from the whiplash from the losing side of an American election is so intense. You never truly know what's going to happen. I don't think anyone anticipated January 6th, and obviously it could have been much worse.
I would argue there are agencies that anticipated January 6th, thinking organically. This is what Langley does. Langley runs these scenarios in other nations. You can argue they ran a scenario of this in Pakistan by taking the most beloved politician and first criminalizing this person and then disallowing his party. They had look, you don't know exactly what's going to happen, but you do have predictive models. I would say there were several organizations that were tied to the United States that had a really good idea that January 6th would happen. But that's just me.
And there's no way to have this much surveillance and this much infiltration of these white supremacist organizations and not have known anything. But historically, the U.S. has had many sort of anti-Nazi, right, committees and campaigns, but it's always coupled with, it's always the right and the left, right? So it'll be anti-Nazi and anti-communism. And guess what happens? All of the resources get devoted to the commies. And so likewise, it is the so-called domestic terrorists who are the left wing, right? The anarchists, the land defenders who are constantly being targeted and who are being arrested and whose plans are being foiled. It's not the right wing. So.
And that's especially terrifying in a country that still has Guantanamo operational, right? Like you still have black sites that are operational that Americans kind of know about, but kind of don't remember, kind of don't think it can appeal to you, don't think it can apply to you. But the reality is, once you have been labeled a terrorist, the government has an incredible amount of resources it can dedicate to doing with you whatever it will.
Yeah, but I think that part of the militarization of society is that the United States doesn't even need to hide it.
Right.
They're assassinating people in plain sight. And if you're a leftist and if you're black, it doesn't matter. So that's part of the militarization of the police, right?
Yeah, I mean, it goes right into, again, my last question, which is, like you said, it does seem to be like a workforce problem, or it does seem that we haven't seen the minimum wage raised in like 15 years. I mean, inflation has it way over $15 an hour at this point. Rents are just insane. I mean, we were watching this movie not too long ago, not to top story time here, but The Maltese Falcon. And they were, it was like, oh, this thing we'll give you $3,000 for this. And we were trying to figure out how much $3,000 was back in 1950. And it was enough, in fact, to buy a house. $3,000 was the average house price in the United States. And that inflation today brings us to about $68,000, which is way, way under the actual amount of a house, which is over $500,000. I just wanted to mention this because this had come out. There are inmates in the Angola prison right now, which is, just a huge prison facility in Louisiana, dying of heat stroke. And, to your point, Dr. CBS, and like the commentary surrounding Haiti, I mean, we see mainly Black people here, got Black people incarcerated in much higher rates than their white counterparts or non-black counterparts, working for 20, 30 cents an hour for mega corporations like McDonald's and Walmart, Amazon. Yeah, and I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on that or could elaborate.
Well, see, I don't. So there's a discourse about prison population, about mass incarceration, that the point is to get slave labor. I don't know that to be true. Like, I think that Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's book, Golden Gulag, is a different sort of framework for that. It's more about warehousing, basic warehousing, um, unproductive populations. And in a prison, it's actually a small percentage that have jobs, right? Like most don't have jobs. So it's more extractive than exploitative. Like exploitation is a labor relationship, but extraction, you extract values and rents in many other ways, like the telephones, for example, like um, charging. They now, in many facilities now, incarcerated persons are charged for going to medical, for a Tylenol, for a Band-Aid. If you get caught taking an extra tray, that's called beating the deuce. I watch a lot of prison YouTube. This is one of the random things that I do. But anyway, you get charged, they throw the extra tray away, and then you get charged $12. Right. And so I think that there's other forms of extraction beyond like the exploitation, but the labor relation. But I do think that it is the carceral state is to replace the welfare state. It's like we're not giving you the basic things that you know, food, clothing, and shelter, for example. We'd rather warehouse you here and construct you as disposable in criminal populations, thereby subjecting you to these horrible conditions that are then legitimated, right? Because ostensibly you're a criminal. And so I think that that's the sort of model that we're careening toward. And that, you know, going back to Kamala Harris, so everybody is up in arms about 2025. I think we need to pay more attention to what I've called 2020 vibes, right? Which is Kamala Harris's platform. You know, so $25,000 toward a home when the average home price is, as you're saying, up, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars, and this is supposed to be a win, right? A $6,000 credit for a new baby when daycare, for example, is more expensive than it's ever been. Like these things are, they're just playing in your face at this point. But part of what, so, and the other thing I want to say about Project 2025 is that this is actually not new. Um, the Heritage Foundation actually prepares these documents for every single Republican presidency. They've been doing it since the first one was in 1981 with Ronald Reagan. And I think that the hubbub around Project 2025 has to do with, I think that the first Biden presidency was more about like demonstrating strength and hope and all this other bullshit. And this one is about fear mongering. And so I think that that's why the propaganda is putting, and coupled with the fact that, um, you know, many of Biden's policies really, especially around the border, around policing, really coalesce with the Republican Party. And so I think that that's why there's been so much attention to this particular presidential package, which has been in existence for like, they always do. They're a think tank. This is what they do. And so, you know, anyway, to make a short story long, I think that both parties are invested in the immiseration of working people, of poor people, of colonized people. And this begs the question, right? So an example that I always give is that when Trump implemented the so-called Muslim ban and there was the kids in cages, there were so many protests. There was so much organizing around it. Biden's militarization of the border is worse. There are still kids in cages, and I have seen zero protests around that. There's a lot around Palestine, to be fair, but zero around that. And so is Kamala further mollification? Whereas because people are so fearful for their own individual rights under Trump, that there will be more fight back. I don't know. And I wouldn't wish, you know, the tangerine tyrant on anybody, but these are the political questions that we need to be asking. And I don't know. And it seems like we are a deeply unserious electorate. So I don't know if that's gonna happen.
I go back to the quote from AOC as she was out there doing her protesting when she was like, when a bill passes and it's just a crumb, you get that crumb.
You get that crumb.
And it seems like that's what the Democratic platform always is like, if there's a crumb, you get that crumb. If you vote for us, you useless POS, you know what I'm saying? Any final thoughts from you on that, Umoja or Dr. CBS?
I would just say the first thing I remember Kamala doing as the vice president was her whole "Don't Come" speech. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is what she's represented. I mean, one of the very few policies she was connected with explicitly, like from the beginning of that time. I just go back to, I remember the whole Putin speech where they're asking him, who do you prefer? The Democrats and the Republicans. And he's like, the Democrats, I guess, because at least I know exactly what they're going to do. Whereas with Trump, I have no idea what he's going to do. And they still act like, Putin is like invested in Trump, like they're friends. And it's like, you can't even misconstrue these things. They've had what you could argue is basic diplomacy. And I guess that's just the only thing is we're past diplomacy now. Like there isn't even conversation with these people. Like the United States, I think the Iran situation is perfect in describing this, and that, you have the leaders of Canada and Britain, ostensibly, because Starmer looks like he's on his way out, France, Germany, and Italy writing and calling the Iranian president and asking explicitly not to escalate, though, again, there's no such remonstrative punishments towards Netanyahu. But the Americans can't even do that because they have literally no diplomatic relations with Iran. Like, we're just past an era of diplomacy.
Like, how can we negotiate if you send a drone to blow up the negotiator?
Well, Americans don't even have a negotiator. So, again, they're to the right of the Israeli position. I mean, that says a lot.
Well, to be fair, I think that the Qataris, those are the Americans. Like those are all like U.S. vassal states, and so they're basically negotiating the U.S. position, I would imagine. So,
yeah, I mean, it seems like that. The Saudis and UAE and sort of all these
there's always
American aligned.
There is always a
Go ahead. Did you have to?
I was just gonna say, yeah,
okay.
Yeah,
hey, yeah, it is.
Such a hopeful conversation.
No. Here's what it is. Like we talk about this all the time. Like the reality of the world it's tough to handle, but it is the reality of the world. And again, it's why we're here to have these conversations. I just want to say again, thank you so much, Dr. CBS, for being here. Hope to have you back on again sometimes. Let us
Absolutely.
know especially when you moved in and all those other things. I do appreciate that you fit us in. I want to give a shout out to our podcast listeners, everywhere you find podcasts. We're also here on YouTube. Like, subscribe, you know the deal. We are on Patreon. I want to give a shout out to our Patreon members, our patrons: Kelly, Dubsy22, Nicole Hedges, J Goulart 94, No Ground, RK, Paula, Lissa, Lauren, Suzette, Dennis. I'm going to have all of Dr. CBS's information on the bottom, as well as her books. Go get those books you need. People need money, man. Okay. All right. Look, it's tough to be a professor out here in the world. I don't know how much they're paying, but I know it ain't enough. And you just moved. Yeah. So need a little funding. I appreciate you being here. For Umoja Lil Tanky Sumler, I'm Amin TMK for Inner City Left, and we are out.
Thanks, guys.
Party of Andrew Jackson will not save you.
System riding to the core. Yeah. Reppin' Inner City Left.